So hello everyone, and hello Susan.
Hello,
Today
Marcin.
we have the pleasure of speaking to Professor Susan Golombok, Director of the Center for Family Research at the University of Cambridge, about her new book, We Are Family, What Really Matters for Parents and Children. Here it is, published by Scribe in the UK on the 8th of October, as well as in the US by Public Affairs early this month. So it is my pleasure to open the book launch for Susan Golombok's We Are Family. Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for joining us. And while Susan and I are in conversation for the coming 35 minutes or so, I'd also like to encourage everyone to post your questions in the Zoom chat. After the interview, I will do my best to pick as many questions as possible, and hopefully Susan can answer them live in the remaining 20 minutes or so of our book launch. So I don't think I need to introduce Professor Susan Golombok, but just to remind that her research has examined, as the title of her previous book phrased it, modern families. That is, families created by lesbian mothers, gay fathers, single mothers by choice, trans parents, as well as families created by reproductive technologies such as IVF, donor insemination, egg donation, and surrogacy. And to put it short, since the mid-1970s, Susan Golombok has been looking at what really matters for children's and families' psychological well-being, as the subtitle of the book says, What Really Matters for Parents and Children in the UK edition. So Susan, what really matters for parents and children? If we could start off by that.
Well, you're starting off with a very big question. I thought you might get to that one at the end, Marcin. Well, put in a nutshell, what our research has shown over the last several decades is that people assume that what matters a lot is the structure of families, particularly that children have a mum and a dad and that they're biologically related to their parents. And what our research has shown over the years with many different family types, that what really matters is not so much that, but the quality of relationships within the family, so between parents and their children, but also the social environment in which the family is situated. So whether these social environments are warm and accepting towards the families, or, as sometimes happens with many of the families we study, are not so warm and accepting, and sometimes quite negative and stigmatizing of these families.
Thank you very much. I think this message is so important also because in so many jurisdictions today, the structural aspects of the family, such as the number, gender, sexual orientation, genetic relatedness of parents, are thought to matter and are given legal and social support, while so many families are still marginalized. Published over a dozen academic books, notably your single-authored Parenting What Really Counts in 2000, and the more recent Modern Families, Parents and Children in New Family Forms in 2015, which have all been widely read, and I've seen them not only in university libraries, but also on bookstands at family conferences and fertility fairs, where parents and prospective parents were reading and buying your books. But this time, you have deliberately written a book for the general public. So what motivated it?
Well, it's something that had been at the back of my mind for quite a long time, because I felt that I really wanted to get the findings of our research to people who wouldn't normally read an academic book. But what particularly triggered it was that the book, the person who was sort of in charge of books at the Wellcome Trust, who fund a lot of our research, approached me one day and suggested that I do this. So that kind of solidified the idea in my mind, and having someone come and say, you know, I think this would be a good idea and we'll help you to do it, made a huge difference. So that was really what triggered it.
Let's talk a little bit about how this research and this book actually happened. And first, I'd like to thank you for the tone of this book, precisely what you have introduced the book for the general public, because you show both your study findings, the social circumstances within which they came about, and your own adventures and challenges as a researcher. So I felt when reading, like you've taken us on a journey in this book, and it's been a very special journey reading it. So thank you. And for instance, in the preface to your book, where you recall when as a 22-year-old master's student at the University of London, you began your research, it felt very encouraging to read it. So could you tell us a little bit about how you actually got involved in this research in the mid-1970s? What motivated your research? How did you first get into it?
Yeah, so it was completely by chance. I happened to pick up a copy of the feminist magazine Spare Rib, and in that particular issue in September 1976, there was an article about lesbian mothers who were, without exception, losing custody of their children to their former husbands. And the article asked for somebody to volunteer to do an objective study of these children, because what was happening in court cases is that there would be an expert witness on behalf of the mother, who would generally argue that what mattered was the quality of relationships within the family, as we've just been saying. And the expert on the father's side would have a very different view and would argue that the children were bound to experience problems, really based on assumption, based on outdated psychological theories. And in the absence of any evidence of what actually happened to the children, then judges favored the traditional family, which by the time these custody cases got to court, involved the father who had remarried often by that time. So this article had said, you know, please somebody volunteer to do this work, because it would be very useful to have this information for custody cases. And at the time, I was just beginning a master's degree in child development. So the idea of doing this research was very exciting to me, because it combined my interest in the women's movement with my interest in child development. So I, with great trepidation, contacted the group of mothers mentioned in the article called Action for Lesbian Parents, and who in fact were based in Cambridge at the time. For those of you who are in Cambridge listening to this, in Maid's Causeway, in a large Victorian house there. And I came up from London for a meeting with this group of women, and they asked me lots of questions. They were, of course, concerned that I had preconceived ideas about lesbian mother families. And so we had a long conversation. And at the end, they said, we would like to help you do this research, and we'll help you by putting you in touch with lots of organizations where you can try to recruit lesbian mothers living with their children to study how the children are doing and the issues that they're facing. So that's how it all started. That was 1976. And I thought at the time it was a 3-month master's project, but it turned into much more than that. It turned into really 40 years of research, which I would never have envisioned at the time. So for any master's students who are listening to this conversation, I would say, beware what you choose as your master's topic, because it may be with you for a very long time. So what actually happened was that Michael Rutter, who was professor of child psychiatry at the Institute of Psychiatry at the time, got to hear about the research. And it turned out that he had been the expert witness in some of these early cases. And he had been the witness called on behalf of the mother, who was arguing that, you know, it was family relationships that mattered, not whether or not there was a father in the home. But he had no data to base his arguments on either. So when he heard about the research, he said, if you want to pursue this and turn it into a larger study, I can help you try and get some research funding, which he did, and the Nuffield Foundation generously funded the study, and it turned into something much bigger. And that was one of the first studies of children growing up with lesbian mothers in the world. There were 2 other studies at that time in the United States. And in fact, which is unusual for psychological research, all 3 findings came up with exactly the same conclusions.
I think it's a very encouraging story about how through research one can change things, and thank you for this.
Well, changing things took a while, I have to say. So once we did the research, then I became involved as an expert in custody cases, and the research certainly didn't go down well. And I remember being grilled by barristers on the father's side who tried to just completely pick apart the research on every single detail, much more than an academic reviewer would do. And I also remember one expert on the father's side holding up the paper that we published, saying this wasn't worth the paper it was written on. So a lot of people tried to discredit the research. Well, in fact, that's something that still happens today, but today there's a lot more of it, so it's more difficult to undermine it.
And then also you of course mentioned how it progressed, and how Section 28 in Margaret Thatcher's government actually worsened some kind of stigmatization and conditions for those families. But still you are doing your research at that time already. But what was it like to be starting that completely new strand of research, to be pioneering in a way? Because here I'm thinking about the story that you write on pages 17 and 18, where you first introduced the drastic story of Sue and Mary in England, who lost custody due to their sexuality. And then you recalled, here I'm quoting, "This study case brought home to me the pressing need for evidence on the experiences of children in lesbian mother families. I very much wanted to carry out a study on the children of lesbian mothers for my master's thesis, but no one of my lecturers was willing to supervise me. Some thought the topic wasn't interesting, others that it was too controversial." And then again on page 20 you write how you traveled alone all over the UK to do interviews, and you never knew what it would be like when you were knocking on the door. So how did you manage to navigate all that and to venture on this research?
I don't know. I think I was young. I didn't see it as pioneering research. I just thought it was interesting research. Today in the Centre for Family Research, we would never let our researchers just go off driving around the country. We didn't have mobile phones in these days. The maps were all on paper, and we couldn't keep in touch with people then, the way that we do with our researchers now. So actually, when I think about this, some of the situations I got myself into now, I think, well, actually, these were quite dangerous, and maybe somebody should have not let me do that. But at the time, I think people thought less about these issues. And, sometimes I did end up in quite hairy situations. Some of the families lived out in the middle of the country. I remember one night I went out to interview a family. I don't know where they were, an area I knew nothing about. And they started to have a row. And this row became, more and more fierce. And they were supposed to be taking me back to the railway station. And so things like that happened that, in the end it was fine, and somebody did take me to the railway station. But yes, I think it was very different in these days. The Department of Child Psychiatry at the Institute of Psychiatry, where I was based when I did this early work, they had a Mini that we were allowed to use. So I would take that Mini and drive all over the country, and nobody really knew where I was. But anyway, I survived to tell the tale, and it was fine.
The book includes chronological chapters that follow the kind of research you did. So I was wondering why this chronology had happened. How did new questions come up? Why do you start with lesbian mothers? You have just actually explained it. But then you end on a chapter about trans parents, which is a new chapter in your research, something that you didn't write about yet in the previous book. So how did this chronology happen? How did those studies develop?
Well, after I'd done the early work on lesbian mother families, then around that time, Louise Brown was born, the first IVF baby. And so that made me think about new kinds of families more generally, because there was a lot of hostility. It's hard to think about that now, but at the time Louise Brown was born and the early IVF babies, I mean, mothers would talk about being, people would accost them in the street and, say nasty things to them, and there was sort of a lot of talk about Frankenstein babies and so on. So actually, although now we just see IVF as something, that's pretty ordinary and part of lots of people's lives, in these days, there was quite a lot of prejudice against that as well. So I suppose I saw parallels between IVF and the other assisted reproductive technologies that followed, and what had happened with the lesbian mothers that I'd been studying. So I then became more interested generally in how different types of families impact on parents' relationships with their children and also in children's development and well-being. So I then started probably the first study of the psychological development and well-being of children born through IVF and donor insemination, which I did in collaboration with colleagues in the Netherlands and Italy and Spain, as well as the UK. And we followed these families up. We saw them first when the children were 6, and then when they were 12, and then again when they were 18. And I should say, I wrote this book, but I could never have written this book without all the wonderful researchers, members of my team, and here in Cambridge and before that in London, who worked on these studies and, have been so influential in the way that the studies were carried out and, what went into the studies and what we found. So it's not me, it's been a whole team of people, which has been part of the pleasure of the whole thing, because, it's been difficult sometimes, but we've also had great fun along the way. Each new family type raises different kinds of questions. So as each new family type has emerged, we've been interested in, what the implications are. And then more recently, children with trans parents have come more to the fore, and it felt to me as if trans parent families now are in very similar situation to where lesbian mother families were in the 1970s, in terms of parents being denied the right to raise their own children, and with lots of questions being asked about the possible negative consequences for children of, for example, experiencing a parent's transition. So that study, which was carried out again with colleagues at the Centre for Family Research, so Susan Imrie and Sophie Zadeh, that work has looked at the experiences of children who experience their parents' transition to see what it's like for them. So I think our work has really tried to sort of shine a light on what really happens to children in these families, as opposed to what people say will happen.
Because your book is full of stories. It's full of stories. It's a wonderful read for this reason, apart from the research that you are quoting. So what was it like writing it? And maybe revealing a little bit from your workshop, did you have a writing routine? What was it like?
So yes, it's an interesting question. At the beginning, it was really hard because it went so much against everything I'd been taught about writing academically, writing stories. I just I'd never written a story before, ever. You know, sometimes you would take bits of, you know, quotes from things people have said in interviews and use them and something like that. But most of my own research has been much more quantitative than that. So, you know, it hasn't even been about things people have said. It's more been about numbers and statistics and that kind of thing. So at the beginning, it was quite daunting. I had a lot of help at the very beginning, partly because I was introduced to a wonderful agent who helped me at the beginning. And also I had a wonderful editor at Scribe. So they helped. And some things they said were just so obvious to them, but such a revelation to me. So I remember one day, you know, sitting and they come up to have a chat in the Centre for Family Research. And my editor said to me, you know, if you've got a story, say at the beginning of a chapter, you can come back to it later at the end. I did kind of get to grips with it. And then I became, you know, I began to really, really enjoy it. And now I prefer, if I was to be really honest about it, I actually prefer writing stories than writing academic papers. Because now when I write an academic paper, I just think, oh, this is all a bit dry, a bit formulaic. And it was much more fun writing about people's lives and people's experiences. So yeah, I really enjoyed it in the end. And yes, I mean, one thing that was really nice was going back to people who'd taken part in our studies. And one in particular, a woman I hadn't seen for 40 years. So in 1978, she was one of the first lesbian women in Britain to have a baby through donor insemination. And a London newspaper exposed the fact that a Harley Street doctor was offering donor insemination to lesbian women. And she was, you know, trailed around by the press, and she had a terrible time and managed by going to court to hide her identity. So I went back to see her to ask her about her experiences 40 years later, by which time she lived in the countryside in Dorset, and she had become a wonderful baker, and she invited me to her cottage and made me a wonderful cream tea, which I did talk about in the book because it was a memorable experience. And by that time, this little boy who caused all the uproar was 40 years old, and he had a very senior job in a marketing firm and was about to have a baby of his own. So, you know, visits like that to people I haven't seen for years or decades, and hearing what had happened to the children, which was, you know, often very heartwarming stories like that, was part of the fun of writing the book.
Another question that I had is about methodologies. How did you develop methodologies for your research back then when you were starting, and then all throughout? Because importantly, this also boils down to the question, what methodology for family research you argue for. I noted down also this quote that I would like to read from page 23, where you write, "The limitations of our research were often exaggerated by the fathers' councils in custody disputes. However, research on families cannot be carried out with the same precision as research in the basic sciences, as families cannot be experimented on in the same way. Family researchers have to work on alternative ways, slowly building up a picture based on a series of investigations that focus on different questions and repeating those investigations." So what about the methods?
Okay, so I began my research career at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. And so I was trained very much on the kinds of procedures they were using there for studying families, which were mainly in-depth standardized interviews. So we carried out the interviews, we got a lot of very detailed information about the parents, about the children, about their relationships. And then we were trained to code this data in a very strict way. You know, we had coding manuals that were really thick, and we had to code all kinds of things, from what the parents said, their facial expressions, all kinds of things. And we then sort of built up a picture of the relationship between the parents and the child. We also had transcripts to do with the child's behavior that were assessed by child psychiatrists who didn't know anything about the nature of our studies. So it was actually, although we were using interviews, it was all turned into numbers. It was a very quantitative kind of approach. And that's kind of what I was brought up on, very much a kind of quantitative approach to studying families. And we also use questionnaires. One thing that was very important right from the start was getting data not just from all family members, but also from people outside the family, such as children's teachers, because it was really important to have independent views of how the children were doing, because people would say, oh, well, of course, you know, these mothers are going to say their children are doing fine. Of course, they're going to paint them, you know, in the best possible light. So that was an important aspect. So really, that was the approach I used until I moved to Cambridge in 2006. And at that point, there were people in the Centre for Family Research who were experts on qualitative research. And so the person who moved with me from London was Vasanthi Jadva, who's been very instrumental in all the work that we have done and still is, and you know, has been the person leading a lot of the studies, for example, of surrogacy and so on. So Vasanthi and I arrived in Cambridge, and you know, having used very similar methods for a long time, and our eyes were opened to more qualitative methods. And it was something that, you know, I had kind of been brought up to be very disapproving of. It was seen where I'd come from at the Institute of Psychiatry as sort of not real science. And, you know, so I did have my own prejudices about that. But I could see, and I began to learn by speaking to people in the Centre for Family Research, that qualitative research can be just as important. It just answers different kinds of questions. So then we began to adopt more of a mixed methods approach. And the other thing we began to do, which was becoming more and more important for developmental psychologists, was to use observational methods of parent-child interaction. One thing that hasn't changed is that for most of our work, it's very in-depth. So we don't study very large samples. We study smaller samples, but we go into family homes all around the country, and the researchers spend hours often collecting data. And we go back repeatedly, and we do a lot of longitudinal work. And that's something else that I think is very important, because it's only by longitudinal research you can look at events that have happened in childhood and how they impact later development and well-being. So one issue that I mentioned before that's been central to the work we've been doing is how and when and whether parents disclose to children the method of their conception. And because we see our families repeatedly as the children grow up, that we know exactly when parents began to talk to their children, or whether they did, but if they did, when, and what they said, and these kinds of conversations. And we can look at how factors associated with disclosure predict later well-being, later relationships with parents. So that's an advantage of longitudinal research. And that study that several members of the centre are still involved in, that study now, we're going back for the last time, we've seen the children 7 times from age 1, and now we're going back for the last time now that they're 21. So it really gives a whole picture from childhood all the way up to adulthood. And the other thing that we do when the children are older is we speak to the children themselves about their thoughts and feelings and experiences. So for example, people used to say, well, children born through surrogacy, you know, they're going to be this shouldn't be allowed. The children are going to be very upset about it. You know, they'll be really distressed to find out that one woman conceived them, gave birth to them, right from the beginning, knowing that they would be handed over to other parents. And it was just assumed that this is something that was going to be very problematic for children. But when we actually went back to these children and spoke to them when they were teenagers, we found that for most of them, they weren't really the slightest bit interested in the surrogacy or how they'd been conceived. Or, you know, it was just part of their life, and they saw the surrogate. They often had relationships with the surrogate's own children. And, you know, it wasn't this terrible event in their lives, you know, that had a devastating effect on them, as, you know, people had claimed when they were first born.
You have done research both with children and research and actually outreach in schools, which is one very interesting aspect of your research that you write about, where you bridge academia and society, and you go to schools. So could you say a little bit about this, about the report and the study that you did in schools?
Yes, so this was a study we did with Stonewall, and it happened because Stonewall came to us and asked us if we'd be willing to do a study of the school experiences of children with same-sex parents. So Helen Statham and Basanti again were involved in this study, and they went into schools and they carried out focus groups with children from little children age 4 right up to you know, children leaving school. So what we were trying to do is find out what schools could do better for children with same-sex parents. And the thing I really like about the study is that the children themselves came up with a set of 10 recommendations. For example, schools should take responsibility for explaining about different kinds of families, not leave it to the children who kept having to tell their story over and over again. That there should be families like theirs in teaching materials. They also said if there's homophobic bullying at school, then teachers should do something about it. And Stonewall then, from the research, produced resource packs that went out to tens of thousands of schools all over the country to help teachers really learn more and be more effective in terms of you know, working with children who came from families that were different from the kind of traditional mum and dad family. So that was an example of really listening to what children had to say, and then trying to respond by you know, making their views known and helping teachers in particular understand more about what it was like for children to be in a school where perhaps their family wasn't completely accepted.
You mentioned Stonewall that wanted to work with you and offered this at some point. What was it like in the other cases?
So yes, I mean, for me, I think the most rewarding part of this whole research endeavor of over the last 40 years is when policymakers and legislators take note of our findings, and that feeds into conversations and eventually legislation about changes in the family. So, you know, I suppose it's the thing I feel most pleased about or most proud of, however you want to put it, is that our research has been used in marriage equality legislation in many countries, but I know certainly in this US Supreme Court ruling in 2015, but also more recently in changes to the law in France in terms of, you know, access to assisted reproduction by same-sex parents, and in a number of other countries in the world. So I know it's been used for that, but also in terms of assisted reproduction. So in this country, it certainly fed into the debates about joint adoption by same-sex couples, and also changes to the Human Fertilization Embryology Act that allowed lesbian couples and gay couples to become the legal parents of children born through assisted reproduction, and also the more recent change in the law that's allowed single men who had children through surrogacy to apply for parental order to become the legal parents of their children. So these are just some that come to mind, but yes, it's very nice as a researcher if people actually read it and listen to it and are interested in the findings, and particularly, you know, if they actually take account of the findings and see it as something more objective than just simply people's opinions and attitudes.
And at the same time, while talking about this social impact of your research and policy impact, you also talk in the book about how you engaged with theory and how this research challenged some theoretical assumptions in the field.
Yes, well, when I started out as a young developmental psychologist in the 70s, then really the main theories of child development were based on the supremacy of the traditional family. So, you know, classic Freudian theory was still taken very seriously in terms of understanding children's development, but also newer theories in psychology like social learning theory, all really just the assumption was that children needed a mother and a father. And if they didn't have that, then their development might go askew in one way or another. And our research, you know, over the years has shown more and more that that's not the case. So that if children don't have two parents, if they just have one, or if children don't have a parent of one gender or the other in their family, or if children lack a genetic or gestational relationship with one or both parents in their family, or well, these are just some examples of the kind of structural aspects of the family that have always just been assumed to be important. And our research has shown that actually these structural components, as we said at the beginning, aren't nearly as important as they were thought to be in the 70s and 80s. And so over the years, then I suppose that has challenged sort of entrenched theories of the influences of parents on children's development.
Have you faced any backlash to this kind of research throughout the years? Any negative reactions or even attacks or backlash?
Yes, I have. So, I mean, there's certain, more from the US than the UK, but certainly from some very right-wing religious groups in the US. They have tried to discredit the research, and, you know, they've written papers and, you know, trying to tear apart every single possible thing that could be wrong methodologically. But I've also had hate mail, and I suppose that's worse since the internet. I've had glitter bombs, which sound not very serious, but actually are really unpleasant when they arrive. So you have an envelope that arrives on your desk and open it, and then you get covered from head to toe in glitter and all over the carpet and everything. And so that's really unpleasant because it's very hard to get rid of all this glitter, and it's a constant reminder that there are people out there who are really hostile to you. So yes, I suppose I have, but it's, you know, it's compared, you know, in the general scheme of things, it hasn't been very much, but it has happened over the years.
We'll see. It only shows why such a book is so important. And here, I think we're getting to the last question for now, which is about the future, about your last chapters. What are some pending issues to be looked at today?
Yes, so at the moment, at the Centre for Family Research, so people working in our team are studying some of these new family forms. So, for example, Sarah Foley and Basanti Jadber are studying co-parenting. So that's when people meet over the internet to find someone to parent with, but they don't have a romantic relationship. That's something that's quite new. We're very interested to see how that plays out. You know, again, there's a lot of assumption that this will be bad for children, because usually children, at least not always, but they're conceived in the context of a romantic relationship, even though that breaks down later. But there are other ways of looking at it. You know, some people see it as a way of, well, it's sort of like having a known donor, but the donor might be a bit more involved in the family. So this is something we just don't know the answers to, but we're doing this work. Susie Brown in the center is studying trans parents who have children after their transition. Anya McConaughey and Kate Shaw are studying lesbian mothers who have children through shared biological parenting. So when one woman's egg is used to create the pregnancy that, so the other woman is pregnant and gives birth. These are some of the new family forms. Oh, and identifiable egg donors. So Joe Lyson, Susan Imrig, and Basanti are looking at children born through identifiable egg donors, because in this country, soon the first cohort of children to be able to find out who their donor is will reach age 18 in 2023. So we're interested in how that pans out for children and their parents. So these are some of the emerging family forms we're studying at the moment. And then there are others on the horizon. Some may happen, others may not, but people are talking about synthetic eggs and sperm, which will allow same-sex couples, both partners, to be the biological parents of their children. I mean, this isn't possible yet, but it's something that may be on the horizon. There's heritable gene editing, which is another big issue at the moment. There is the prospect of artificial wombs. So yeah, the family's changing all the time. I don't think I'll be the one studying them all, but I'll be interested to see what other people find as they follow them up.
So on this note, thank you so much, Susan, for the conversation today.
Well, thank you, Marcin, for speaking to me about it.
Thank you, and for your work. If anyone would like to hear and read more, please do buy the book, which is now available. It's, as I said, it's as you will see yourselves, as we've been trying to introduce, it's a great read, and I think it's really special to have a scientific book, which is also such a good read. So I really encourage you to read it. After this recording, we have some 20 minutes for live questions and answers with Susan, so please stay connected. Thank you everyone for joining us today. On a personal note, I must say that it's been a particular joy speaking to you, Susan, today in 2020, which marks 10 years since I first arrived in Cambridge, then as a PhD student, a visiting PhD student, before I later moved to Reproductive. So thank you very much, and see you live in just a moment.